Welcome back, readers. We're going to read Chapter 9, Mission of Mystery in Rocky Mountain National Park today. Chapter 9. Jake opened the door to see a woman his mom's age walking toward them along the campground road. She had a contagious smile and dark brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. Walking beside her was a girl who looked like an almost exact copy of her mom. Both wore shorts, t-shirts, hiking socks, and boots. Jake's mom ran to greet them. "Jacqueline, it's so good to see you." She gave Mrs. Catalina a hug. "And Amber, you've grown so much since our last visit. You look so much like your mom." "Thanks, Mrs. Evans." Amber gave a nervous smile and raked her hand through her hair. This was not the Amber who Jake remembered from 5 years ago when the Catalinas had visited their home in Ohio. The first thing he noticed was that she was nearly as tall as him. Jake straightened up. He had grown so much in the last year that his parents would often say things like, "You're slumping again," or "Don't slouch." He was always forgetting. But in this moment he remembered. Amber had long golden brown hair with a bright purple streak that fell across the left side of her face. Her skin was dark, like her parents'. "Jake and Wes, come over here." Mrs. Evans motioned for the boys to join them. They walked up, and the introductions began. Wes was obviously thrilled to meet new people and became very talkative. Jake got very quiet, nervously rubbing the pocket of his hiking pants with one of his hands. He didn't want to admit that he was embarrassed by his cousin's excitement. But if he kept standing there still as a tree, not saying a word, he would appear impolite and awkward. So he decided to ask Amber a question. "How was your trip here?" Amber shrugged. There was a lot of desert between California and Colorado, so kind of boring. It's nice to see trees again. "Where is Lewis?" Mrs. Evans asked. "He's checking in with the campground attendant." Mrs. Catalina pointed back toward the campground entrance. "We were so excited to see you guys that we just couldn't wait." Mrs. Catalina's accent sounded very different from her daughter's. She and her husband were from Argentina, where Amber had been born. But Amber had lived 12 of her 13 years in Northern California. "Jake and Wes, when Mr. Catalina pulls up, could you help him get them settled in?" Mrs. Evans asked. "Sure thing," both boys said at the same time. A few minutes later, Louis Catalina arrived, backed the camper into the site beside them, and got out to greet everyone. He shook Jake's hand. "Jake, you're 2 feet taller than I remember you, and you must be Wesley." He extended his hand to Wes. "Yes, sir, you can call me Wes. And you boys can both call me Louis. None of that sir stuff needed here." Louis Catalina had dark eyebrows, a nose that looked like it was from a Roman sculpture, and a thin dark beard and mustache. Jake didn't know about the Catalinas, but he did remember that Mr. Catalina had a job doing top secret stuff for a company that worked for the government, something to do with missiles. Jake had always thought that was cool. While helping Amber put up her hammock, Jake noticed that Uncle Brian was talking with her parents about something. His uncle glanced over at them. Amber's parents did the same. "I bet they're talking about tonight," Wes said. "What about tonight?" Amber asked. Wes tightened the nylon strap around the tree trunks to secure the hammock. "After dinner, there's something they want to talk with us about." Amber looked at Wes and Jake. "You guys have any idea what it is?" Wes shrugged his shoulders. "No clue." That evening the dads put 2 picnic tables next to one another so that the 3 families could eat dinner together. The Catalina family made the meal, an Argentine barbecue called asado, skewers of steak, sausage, pork, and roasted potatoes. Amber brought over plates of hot sweetbread, then came back with dishes of chimichurri sauce. Jake looked across the table at Wes, who was taking in the feast before him. He looked up at Jake. "I think I'm in heaven." "Speaking of heaven," Mr. Catalina folded his hands, "let's give thanks for our food." The families held hands and bowed their heads as Mr. Catalina prayed a blessing in Spanish. When he was finished, he clapped and smiled at the boys. "Vamos a comer, let's eat." After dinner, Jake and Wes were assigned dish duty. When they were almost finished, Uncle Brian stepped out of his RV carrying a pack of chocolate bars, a box of graham crackers, and a big bag of marshmallows. "Who's ready for some s'mores?" he called out. The boys furiously dried the last of the dishes and rushed over to where Uncle Brian was handing out the roasting sticks. Soon the scents of toasted marshmallows and melted chocolate surrounded the campfire. Jake watched Amber hold her marshmallow close to the coals until it ignited. She pulled it from the fire, patiently let it burn for a few seconds, and then blew out the flame. Perfect, she whispered to herself, satisfied with its caramel brown color. Everyone was in various stages of roasting and eating their dessert when Uncle Brian cleared his throat. We have a challenge for you kids. This got Jake's, Amber's, and Wes's attention. The parents got together this afternoon, Uncle Brian leaned forward in the firelight. And we were talking about all the amazing places we'll be visiting over these next 2 months, and how you three are now old enough to want to do some things on your own. So we decided that we want to allow you to go hiking and exploring without us following you around all the time. And we want you to be safe. Jake, Amber, and Wes looked at each other, amazed their parents would allow them to adventure out on their own. The parks they visit were untamed and wild places, full of beauty and sometimes dangers. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity for you, Uncle Brian continued, to master stuff you could never learn in school, like how to predict the weather and read maps, what gear and food to pack, and all kinds of things about plants and wildlife. Dad, Wes said, what did you mean by it being a challenge? We want to give you some group assignments. The three kids let out a collective groan. This was now starting to sound like a bad school project. Uncle Brian laughed. Okay, think of these as missions instead. That sounds way better, Jake replied. All three kids were now leaning in, interested in what Uncle Brian would say next. We want you three to plan your own adventures. And by plan, I mean you will need to write out your itinerary each time and give us a clear ETA. That's your estimated time of arrival, back at the campground or the trailhead where we'll pick you up. Mr. Evans sat down in the camp chair next to Uncle Brian. We want to see that you're really thinking things through. You'll need to know the weather forecast, pack the best gear, clothes, and food, that kind of thing. Each mission, will be an opportunity for you three to build trust with the six of us parents. Uncle Brian looked at each of the kids. The more trust you build with us, the more skills and knowledge you gain on your missions. The more we'll feel more confident allowing you to explore on your own. Jake looked over to see Amber, who was lit by the firelight, raising her hand. Yes, Amber, you have a question? Uncle Brian asked. Yeah, I was wondering about writing the itinerary. How do we do that? It's going to be a list of places you plan to go and the trails you plan to take to get there. So if something were to happen, we would know how to work with the rangers to find you. There are way too many stories about people who have died in the backcountry but would have survived if they just left an itinerary with a friend or family member. Jake looked at his mom. Sounds like a good reason to bring a cell phone. She gave him a mean stare that turned into a subtle smile.